right. All right, so we're going to go back to 1932. We know that the economy is crashing. We know that unemployment is rising. We know that banks are failing. We know that Hoover is everybody's favorite president. Not quite. The shanty towns that were popping up in communities where people had lost their homes because of foreclosures were called Hoovervilles. There were also Hoover blankets, which of course are newspapers, because homeless people sleep under newspapers. And then there were, I don't think I have, I think I do. Hoover flags. Your empty pockets turned inside out for Hoover flags. So Hoover is potentially not on America's list of favorite people at the moment, and it's only going to get worse. I feel like I say that a lot in APUSH. It's going to get worse. Here's what happens. So remember those World War I soldiers who had come back from the war and they were a little bit peeved that the industrial workers had been doing so well and had better pay and da-da-da-da. Remember all that? Well, the way that the U.S. government had responded to that, if you remember, is they said, don't worry, we appreciate your patriotism and your valor, and we're going to write a bill that's going to provide you with a bonus, a pension basically to be paid 20 years in the future. And so don't worry, you're going to keep working, but then when you retire, you're going to have this nest egg you can fall back on and you can count on. So we're going to have this bonus. Well, in 1932, huge numbers of World War I veterans are going to march on Washington, D.C., many of them spending their very last dimes and nickels to physically get there. And they're demanding from Congress the immediate payment of those bonuses. We need the money now. We can't wait until 1940, whatever. We need it right now. The thing is that even if Congress had wanted to be held hostage by a group of, half-dressed, half-showered, homeless veterans, they didn't actually have the money to give them, right? Just like the rest of the country, the U.S. government was struggling with financially as a result of the economic crash. Not to mention that a lot of the loans hadn't been paid back because of the Dawes Plan all falling apart. Anyway, you get where I'm going with this. So the government doesn't have the money to pay them. So the Bonus Army, which we can relate a lot to, what was that thing that happened back in the Gilded Age? Coxey's Army, right? So the Bonus Army is going to just set up camp in Washington, D.C. They build their own shanty town, which you can kind of see there in flames. They build their own shanty town. They're going to, regularly parade before the Capitol. And President Hoover has had about enough. He, if you'll remember, had this really rough upbringing, right? So he had been orphaned. He had to go out west and live with his family where he had this really hard life. He had put himself through school. He had worked. He had almost literally pulled himself up by his bootstraps, right? That, colloquial phrase. So he had done so much, and he felt like these veterans asking for handouts, why couldn't they just take no for an answer? They just need to go away. They're causing disorder. They're diminishing the respectability of the government. They just need to leave. He orders them to leave. They don't go. So he orders the U.S. Army, with bayonets fixed, to go and march through the camp and forcibly evict them. At some point, maybe accidentally, maybe not, the camp catches fire. Several people are killed. Others are horribly burned. And these are the pages on the front page, are the pictures on the front page of every newspaper. What of a chance do you think that Hoover has of being elected in 1932? Zero? I think zero. I think it's a 0% chance of being reelected in 1932. In fact, the phrase "a yellow dog Democrat" comes from the election of 1932. So I always joke that my grandmother was a yellow dog Democrat, and my dad is probably the same. And it's because the saying went that you could have put a yellow dog on the Democratic ticket, and the yellow dog would have won, because anyone was going to pick anybody but Hoover. So Hoover is going to have a pretty tainted reputation. But let's look a little bit more in depth at the man of Hoover. So remember that Hoover had this life experience that had told him that if you work hard enough, you can overcome almost any adversity. Remember that he had presided over which organization during World War I? The Food Administration, right? So he had been in charge of the Food Administration during World War I. And remember, the Food Administration was organizing a voluntary effort, right? The Food Administration wasn't about imposing legal rations. That will come in World War II, but that wasn't what was happening in World War I. It was all volunteerism. Let's encourage Americans to make some sacrifices, to dig a little deeper, and we can, make the country, well, I can't resist, make America great again. So remember, those are his life experiences. So Hoover, as the Depression gets worse and worse, he insists that the worst possible thing we could do is to create a society of government handouts. People are calling on the government to help. He says that's the worst thing we can do. He believes that the most important value, like the most important American ideal, is this notion that he calls rugged individualism. That every man for him or herself, every man or woman for him or herself, that everybody can take care of themselves. You work hard, nobody hands anything to you, and you are self-sufficient and independent, and that's what makes America great. He was really concerned about the kind of country we would become if the government was overly involved, overly helpful, took away the self-initiative, that we would become this, helpless country that couldn't ever stand up for themselves. That being said, although the popular perception is that Hoover didn't do anything at all to help the Great Depression, it's not quite true. First of all, Hoover is going to be calling in major business owners into the Oval Office and meeting with them on an almost daily basis. And what he's asking them to do is to voluntarily make some sacrifices. Look, I know you're losing money. I know that profits are way down, but you just can't lay off people. Can you please just keep your employees? Because it's only going to get worse if you fire all your employees. The economy is going to continue to spiral down. If you can just hold on, sacrifice for a little while longer, it's going to be all right. The thing is that sacrificing and digging a little deeper works during World War I, when the economy is on the up and up again, right? When the war business is meaning greater profits for every industry. When yes, individuals are having to sacrifice and not eat enough meat, or as much meat as they want, but they have plenty of food to eat, and there's no question that they're going to be able to be well fed. On the other hand, during the Great Depression, the notion of sacrificing, how much do you sacrifice to the point at which you go bankrupt and out of business, and then you can't help anybody at all and can't employ anybody at all? It's a much harder question, and so it doesn't really work very well. There are very few takers on Hoover's proposal that we should just voluntarily sacrifice. Towards the middle of 1932, really just before the bonus march, Hoover realizes that we kind of need something else. It's not working. The Depression is now entering its third year, and it's just getting worse. So then Hoover proposes the one and only alphabet agency attributed to Hoover. You're going to want to remember this one as special, because you have to know that Hoover did this one, not FDR. So the one and only agency that Hoover really creates in a significant way is the RFC. That's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Hoover creates the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And if you remember that Hoover is a Republican, you probably can understand who Hoover chooses to help. So what is the focus, you think, of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation? Who is he going to help? As a Republican president, businesses, and banks. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation offers some government support for large businesses and finance organizations to try and maintain capital available for business, so that the strong businesses aren't forced to close simply for lack of available capital. So the RFC aims at helping to support some capital banks and major businesses, again, to make sure that there's enough capital to keep those businesses successful. The RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Besides that, Hoover's other big push is to encourage state and local governments to do more. As the Depression gets worse and he realizes, okay, maybe private volunteerism is not going to be enough, he begins to try to encourage the states and local governments to increase their own public works programs. The problem is that many of the states are going broke too. So the states are in some ways taking up the charge to create more public works projects, building parks or improving roads, things like that. But as the states run out of money and the local governments run out of money, that becomes problematic. Finally, Hoover will accelerate the timeline for some federal public works projects. For example, the Hoover Dam is constructed during the Great Depression and was really slated to be done much more slowly. But in order to stimulate the economy in a limited way, remember Hoover believing the government should not overreach because it's going to undermine America's character of rugged individualism. But he'll speed up the timeline in order to hire more workers. So the Hoover Dam will be constructed as some small attempts to give a few people a few more jobs. But it's really just not enough. Oh, I like this one. Hard times are still hoovering over us. Anyway, it's really just not enough. And so in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to win everything. I mean, there's Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and Maine, Connecticut. I don't know. Not much else. So, overwhelmingly, by an electoral vote of 472 to 59, Franklin Roosevelt is going to be elected. Now, at first glance, you might not have expected FDR to win in an America that is, suffering this incredible economic depression. He was, figuratively, of course, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, right? The Roosevelt family, more like New York royalty, He had his whole life been in government. He had been in New York politics for a long time, following in the footsteps of Teddy Roosevelt, who was his cousin. But on the other hand, FDR had also experienced hardship in his own life. He, of course, suffered from polio, which left him effectively paralyzed and unable to walk unassisted from the waist down. Paralyzed from the waist down, unable to walk unassisted. And he really felt like the most important thing was for government to do something, right? And so when he's campaigning, he campaigns on this slogan, we want a new deal for America. And when people ask him, what are you going to do? And he goes, I don't really know, but we're going to do something. And the people were they just ate it up. They didn't care what he did. No, they didn't care what the government was going to do. They just needed the government to try something. And Roosevelt made it very clear that he believed the government needed to be actively involved. Now, I want to sort of take a step back here and pause for a moment and let you know that although Roosevelt believed that in this emergency, this Great Depression that was only getting worse, the government needed to jump in, Roosevelt himself was actually, at least by today's standards, really a fiscal conservative. He didn't want the U.S. government to run huge debts. He didn't want to have, this giant government that would last forever and ever. He felt like we needed a strong emergency response and then scale back. You're going to want to remember that because later on, that's going to end up being problematic. Depends on who you ask, but that's going to end up affecting the way that the New Deal legislation is structured. So Roosevelt is not about, wanting to permanently increase the size of the national government. He's not about, we can just spend and tax however much we want to. He really simply believes that in this emergency, we need to take some bigger steps. So the New Deal then is going to be, so Roosevelt was elected in 1932. He's inaugurated in 1933. In that interim period, the Depression is just getting worse, right? 1932 is a year where things are just snowballing, right? Where it started off slow in 29 and in 30. By 32, it's getting much, much worse. And so Hoover actually tries, after the election, he really realizes that maybe we need to do more. Maybe Congress needs to do more. But is Congress going to listen to a ding-dang-dong word that Herbert Hoover says? Absolutely, they wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, right? Herbert Hoover was less popular with everyone in Congress than Obama is with the current Republicans, if you can imagine. So they weren't going to do anything, he said. And so he calls up Roosevelt. Herbert Hoover tries to make contact with Roosevelt. Hey, Roosevelt, if we work together, if we can get Congress to pass these things now, the American people won't have to wait, until later on for your initiatives. And Roosevelt, who was a really savvy politician, refuses to even accept Hoover's calls. He won't talk to him. The things Hoover proposes are things that Roosevelt mostly is going to propose himself. And it probably would have been nice for the American people to get, relief a few months earlier instead of a few months later, but Roosevelt understands that he can't be seen as working with Hoover, because that's going to ruin his reputation as, sort of America's savior. Anyway, the New Deal is going to be kicked off after Roosevelt's inauguration with what is known as the 100 Days. So the 100 days are going to be, I know, you can't guess this, the first 100 days after Roosevelt's inauguration. And in that 100 days, Roosevelt is going to push through a whole series of reforms. And Congress is basically like, yes, absolutely, sounds great. When do you want it? How much money? Anything he asks, they're going to rubber stamp it through the congressional process. So the amount of legislation that comes through in that first 100 days is really pretty remarkable. But the very first thing he tackles, and this is sort of why I was pushing for you to have a different answer earlier, although all of the answers are equally defendable, I think, in terms of which of those causes is most significant. I think we can make a strong argument for each. But what Roosevelt identifies as the biggest problem, and the thing he attacks first, is the banking industry. The thing he does first is the banking industry. So what does he do? Well, first, he's going to create a national banking holiday. Now, tell me about holidays. On, like, President's Day, what's going on with the banks? They're closed. Permanently closed because they failed and you've lost all your money? They just close, like, the workers aren't there, you can't go in. You have to wait until the next day to go and do whatever you have to do for the banks. Well, by declaring a banking holiday, Roosevelt is trying to put a stop to the panic, right? People are, there's these massive runs on the bank. Every day people are trying to withdraw their money, and the more runs there are, even strong banks, even banks that weren't invested in the stock market, are going out of business, are failing, because they simply cannot, give everyone's deposits back immediately. So first he declares a national banking holiday, and then he goes on the radio and gives this public address that he'll end up doing almost weekly throughout his entire presidency. They're known as fireside chats. And the American people would sort of cozy up next to their, fireplaces in their homes, and they'd have the radio next to them, and they'd listen. And Roosevelt in his fireside chat would speak to them as equals. The American people loved Roosevelt. He was seen as one of them, as somebody they could understand. And I'm going to play you a little clip of one of his fireside chats on banking, the very first one. But he didn't talk down to them. He didn't, patronize them and try to simplify things in sort of a silly way. He gave them sort of this honest description. Here's what's going on. He explained it in a way that was really approachable, and he just felt like a president that Americans could be proud of and could just really respect. So in that fireside chat, he's going to talk to them about how banking works. He's going to try to help them distinguish between the problematic banks and normal banking practices, which is important, right? Because if you didn't understand how banks work, and then all of a sudden you find out that they don't have all of your money, they've given it away, or 90% of it away, that might be frightening to you. But so he tries to explain, this is how banks work. It always works this way. It's totally safe. So anyway, we're not going to listen to much of this, but just a little bit of a sample.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning around.
So anyway, he goes on. But you get sort of a feel for the character of the fireside chats. And so he explains to people. So number one, there's a banking holiday. Stop the runs on the bank. During the banking holiday, he explains the federal government sends investigators to every single bank in the country that is still open, every single one of them. And the investigators try to figure out what's going on with this bank. Is it a good bank? It's totally strong, has plenty of reserves, has good investments, everything's fine? Is it a good bank that had good investments, did the right things, but is weak because so many people have withdrawn money that they don't have a lot of liquid assets available? Or is it a bad bank? Bad assets, they've already, there's no way to save that bank. When the banking holiday ends, then, the bad banks, the ones that are too far gone, they made bad investments, they had bad practices, they're forced to close permanently. And you might say, wait a minute, he closed the bank after the banking holiday so nobody else could try to withdraw their money? The answer is yes, and here's why. Because if he closes the bank then, as opposed to letting it stay open for a few more days or however long it takes for it to finally run out of cash, then the depositors will get paid a little bit more back than otherwise, right? I told you the story, I think, about my great aunt, and the nods your heads, right? You heard that story, okay? So she got paid 16 cents on the dollar. Well, if the bank had closed earlier, right, it would have had more cash left, so it could have paid her maybe 50 cents on the dollar or whatever. So closing the banks that were going to fail anyway earlier, it was allowing the people to get paid back a little bit more than nothing at all. For the banks that were good banks, good practices, but they were cash poor because of the runs on the banks, they were given an infusion of capital from the federal government. Here's more money. You need to use this to keep your bank open. You're going to be safe. And then, of course, there were plenty of banks that were totally fine, and they sort of got the thumbs up, like a good job. Then when the banks reopen, he comes back on the fireside chat. He tells American people exactly what he's done. He says, so listen, if your bank opens tomorrow, it is safe. You don't have to worry about it closing. We have checked them. If your bank was not a good bank, it's already closed. So all the banks that are open tomorrow are going to be good banks. You can trust them. They have plenty of money. Your government has looked at them and told you that they are fine. And so as you can see in this political cartoon, the hoarding is about over. U.S. government deposits. And here's the East, the West, the North, and the South with their bagfuls of confidence, right? And so the day after the banks open, for the very first time since the Great Depression began, there are more deposits than there are withdrawals in the banking system. So the people trusted Roosevelt. And so the banking crisis slows and mostly comes to an end. The banks are still weak. We're still going to struggle with the available capital because of the economic system has struggled. But it's on the way up now instead of continuing to go down. Another piece of legislation that's going to come through the 100 days is the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act is going to create an organization called the FDIC. The Glass-Steagall Act is going to create the organization known as the FDIC. And the FDIC stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And the FDIC is a voluntary organization that will regulate banking practices, things like reserve requirements. I told you earlier yesterday that currently we have these reserve requirements of between 8 and 10%. So the FDIC will have these regulations, minimum requirements for reserves. They have regulations about what kinds of investments can banks make with their regular depositors' money. It separates investment banking from consumer banking, which is not a lot of detail that you need to know. But the most important thing is create FDIC. So here's the thing. Does the federal government, under the Constitution, have the authority to tell banks what to do? No, right? We read the Constitution. That doesn't have anything about can tell the banks what to do. On the other hand, if the banks voluntarily want to join a federal program, then there can be strings attached. You want to join FDIC? Okay, here's the rules you have to follow, and we're going to inspect to make sure that you do. So by creating this voluntary organization, now the government has the authority to organize the banks and to make sure their practices are better. Now, why would the banks want to voluntarily join an organization that not only charges them money, they have to pay fees to be part of this organization, but also is going to give them a whole bunch of rules about what they can do? Well, here's why. Because what's it called? Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Because if banks are, I'm sure you've heard this on bank commercials, members FDIC. If banks are a member of the FDIC, then if for whatever reason they have a problem and they fail, all of their depositors' money will be insured up to a certain level. At that point, I think it was $1,000 and it was raised to $5,000 today, present day. Each individual bank account is insured at $250,000. So if the bank closes and fails, the federal government will fully fund all of the depositors' accounts. So why would the banks want to voluntarily have to pay their money to join this organization and follow all the rules? Because who's going to put their money in a bank that is not a member FDIC? Nobody. So it's a way to restore confidence in the banks, to get the American people to feel like they can trust the banking system again, that they can feel confident about, no, I'm going to continue to deposit my money in the bank. It's not going to fail, and even if it does, my money is going to be safe. And we still have FDIC today. It's a really important part of our banking system. And although I have never heard of a bank that was not a member of the FDIC, if you ever find one, don't put your money there. And if you ever get super rich and have more than $250,000 in the bank, number one, remember your good old APS history teacher, and number two, open multiple accounts. So you can have an account, 2 accounts with $250,000 in them each, and then you're still fully insured. So you never want to have more money in the bank than is insured by the FDIC. Okay, anyway, so that's the banking industry and the banking focus of the first 100 days. But in the 100 days, we're going to have a whole bunch more legislation, and they're going to focus on 3 big areas: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, recovery, and reform. Now, I have been using the same story for relief, recovery, and reform since Nate was 2 years old, which has been almost 3 years. But it works so well and is so dumb that you're going to remember it. So here we go. So this one time when Nate was 2, we took him to the Children's Museum. Have you guys been? And Brian? It's pretty cool if you're 2. Or 5. He still likes it. So anyway, we took him to the Children's Museum the very first time, and he was playing, and he was super happy, but there was this really snotty kid. And you know kids, right? Put it all over the place, and it was just kind of gross. But Nate was so excited, he was having so much fun. So, I try to, make sure he's not putting things in his mouth, but he's 2, so, okay. So I'm doing my best I can, but lo and behold, 3 days later, he comes down with the worst cold he had ever had in his 2-year-old life, right? He can't breathe, he's crying, he's coughing, he's got a fever, it's horrible. Now, when I saw that he was really sick, I wanted to provide him with some relief. He had that fever. I could tell that his head hurt. You know what it's like when you have a really tough cold. So I gave him some Tylenol. Did that Tylenol make his cold go away? No, right? Colds are viruses, and you guys are all smart enough to know that the Tylenol didn't actually help him, not be sick anymore. But it made him feel better, right? So relief efforts are going to be programs that aren't going to solve the problems of the Great Depression. They're not going to make it go away. They're not going to make it better. But they are going to help the people short term, help them feel better, make sure they have enough food to eat, make sure they have enough money to be able to stay in their homes. So relief efforts are going to be sort of bandage efforts to just make people feel better temporarily. In order to recover, on the other hand, we're going to have to begin to address the actual problems at hand, right? We're going to have to help get on the mend. So to help Nate recover, I put him to bed, right? Give him lots of rest. Keep him really hydrated, right? Drinking a cup of water does not make him feel better. It's not relief. But it does help his body to fight off whatever it is, right? After a while, we ended up, the cold, it became bronchitis, and so we eventually took him to the doctor, and he gets, antibiotics, and that is going to begin, again, doesn't make him feel better, but is going to begin to, attack the actual problems. So recovery efforts aren't necessarily going to help people in the short term, but they are going to seek to allow a recovery, to allow the economy to begin growing again. And then finally, reform efforts. And the reform effort is that, at least for a while, I was that crazy mom in the Children's Museum with hand sanitizer, and after every single exhibit, I was going to sanitize to make sure that never happened again. So reform efforts are going to attempt to stop the problem from ever happening again. So of the banking policies we learned, what was an element of recovery? Well, FDIC is going to be reform, right? Because the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is going to help to regulate the banks so they don't get into trouble again, and also to make sure that nobody's deposits are ever going to be lost again. So that was reform. The FDIC is reform. So what was an element of recovery? So the closing the bank holiday itself, right? And identifying which banks are the good ones, which ones need a little bit more cash, and which ones need to be closed in the end. That was recovery. And then relief for the banks was a bank holiday itself, right? No more runs in the banks, at least temporarily. We're going to sort of figure out what the problem is. So relief, recovery, and reform are 3 big areas in which the government is going to try to address the issues. So, okay, let's start with the NIRA. Here we go, alphabet soup time. The NIRA. This PowerPoint is already posted in Schoology, so you certainly, if you feel panicked, like you can't get it all down, you can always come back here. So the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, this one you might put a little asterisk. It's going to be eventually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it works for a while. The NIRA is going to organize cooperation between business interests and labor unions to try and hold employment setting and hold wages setting. So they're going to work together. They're going to agree to some compromises. The federal government's going to kind of be the mediator, and they're going to try to hold employment and wages steady. It's going to eventually be declared unconstitutional because the government has no authority to tell businesses or unions what they have to do. But for a while, again, it's going to help to stabilize the economy. Then there are several public works programs. Remember, public works are usually construction projects or some kind of beautification project. It's when the government itself is going to fund some kind of something that's going to benefit the whole community. So building roads or bridges, building parks, creating playgrounds, painting murals in like big downtown areas across the country. My hometown had a big mural painted during the Great Depression. All of those things would count as public works. And so we have the WPA, that's the Works Progress Administration. The PWA, that's the Public Works Administration. And then we'll get to the CCC in a minute. So the WPA and the PWA are both going to seek to put people back to work. Here, let's give them a job. Now, there are some criticisms of the WPA and the PWA. Number one, if they had a real job, that was great. Like if we really had a road to build or a bridge to build, like awesome. But if we didn't have a real job, then we'll hire 100, or a dozen workers and give them shovels and have them dig a hole today, and we'll hire them tomorrow and have them fill it back in. The idea behind that was that if nothing else, they were having to work to earn the money we were going to pay them, and that was better than a direct handout. So even when the projects were worthless, and they weren't always worthless, there was a lot of things in America that were created by the WPA and the PWA. But even when the projects weren't valuable, at the very least, it wasn't a direct handout. We're trying to preserve that character of America. Today, we would call it workfare instead of welfare. But anyway, the WPA was unique in that it not only did these big construction projects, but also sought to hire American musicians, artists, authors, sort of these finer parts of society, so that the idea being that we don't want to lose all of America's culture simply because we're all sort of thrust into these hard times. So they would hire musicians to come and play at national concert halls and give these very patriotic concerts that would uplift American spirits. Artists would be hired to paint murals or put in stained glass displays or whatever it was. Authors would be hired not only to write like propaganda bits for the United States because they did that, but also given some incentives to write literary efforts that are going to buoy American spirits. So they're going to try to get to everybody. The PWA and the WPA also are going to employ both women and men. So there'll be women's projects as well as men's projects. There was some opposition to that because there was a sense that only men should get these jobs because men are the breadwinners and women shouldn't be taking away from men's ability to take care of their families. But the government recognized that women had a role to play, and many women had been working before, and so likely needed to work afterwards. Roosevelt was going to appoint Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor. That's a woman, in case you didn't gather that, which is going to be a really big deal. So he appoints a woman to be the Secretary of Labor. Finally, the WPA and the PWA also have jobs open for African Americans. Now, before you get too excited about that, the African Americans were hired last. They were hired for segregated jobs, and they were paid less than their white counterparts. But FDR is still going to win the undying support of the African American community to this day. African Americans are going to vote Democrat, not Republican, and that's a big shift because remember, up to the Great Depression, the black community was voting Republican every election because that was the party of Lincoln that had saved them from slavery, right? But no, because the New Deal is not closed to black Americans, as many thought that it would, and many in Congress argued that it should be, although there was lots of discrimination, absolutely segregation, it still was in some way beneficial to the African American community, which is going to earn Roosevelt a lot of black votes. The CCC is a unique one. That's the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps. And the CCC is going to hire young, unmarried men. They're going to be given military-style discipline. So they're going to march every morning, do their breakfast. They live in dormitories. They're wearing uniforms. They take it out to the Great Plains where they're going to plant tree breaks to help reduce the effects of the Dust Bowl. They're going to dig irrigation wells. They're going to be working to conserve the environment of the Great Plains. And they're paid, I'm going to get the number wrong. It's either $25 or $30 a week. And they get to keep 5, maybe it's a month. They get to keep 5, and the rest is sent to their family. So their needs are provided for. They don't need a lot of money because they're being, given a place to live and they're fed every day and all this business. So they get a little bit of their money, but most of it's sent home to the family. Here's the brilliance of this. Number one, it's conservation. It's going to help with problems in the Great Plains. Number two, in some really hard economic times, who's most likely to turn to rebellion or radicalism or violence? young, unmarried men, right? So this is going to take this facet of society that if they're all unemployed, right, they have problems. We look in the Middle East, right? Lots of the current conflicts we're seeing in the Middle East now were precipitated by an economic decline in their respective countries, because when people are out of work and can't pay for, can't take care of their families, they are tended to be attracted to radicalism or to violence or to rebellion. So it takes this sort of volatile part of the American society and gives them sort of this like moral work ethic and allows them to provide for their families. Okay, there's one emergency aid organization. Yes, ma'am? Their parents. The parents and their families. So they're all young, like they're under 25. They're not, we're not talking about like 50-year-olds and everything. There's one emergency relief organization. It's FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA. This is what you would think of as welfare. It's just handouts. This one is very short-lived. It is not renewed, so it's passed for either a 1 year or an 18 months duration. And when the 18 months is over, it's closed down because Roosevelt was very uncomfortable with the idea of giving direct handouts to American people. But there was, for a short time, just money. Here, come and get some money so you can buy food for your families. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration. There's aid to the farmers. The AAA, that's the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This one is going to attempt to reform the way that land is used. So it's going to pay farmers not to farm, basically. You should put an asterisk there, too. It's going to be paid for by a tax on food processors. That's going to be ruled unconstitutional, so I'll have to change the program. Another asterisk you might want to include is that this really, really stinks if you're a sharecropper, right? Because if I own land, I farm a little bit of it and I sharecrop the rest, and all of a sudden the government says, hey, we're going to pay you not to farm. You can only farm 75% of the land you own. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to keep farming all of my land, take the money, and kick off my sharecroppers. All right, we're done for today.